Hello all, welcome to this video module. This is for the Bachelor of Arts students of the third year of Psychology. This is for the fifth semester. The paper code is PSC 105 and the paper title is Understanding Psychological Disorders. The title of the unit that we are looking at today is Overview of Abnormal Behavior. The module name is DSM-5 Mental Disorders, in which we will look at the definition, classification and stigma related concepts. This is the first module. My name is Aresh Naik and welcome to this video module. So this is what we are going to look at in today's session. We'll begin with what the DSM-5 is exactly, the definition of mental disorders as the DSM-5 outlines it. We'll look at the classification of mental disorders, and a very important concept which I'm sure you are very familiar with by now, stigma. So let's begin. But before that, let's take a look at what are the learning outcomes. So at the end of this module, these are the things that you will be able to do. So first is explain the significance of the DSM in the context of mental disorders. Next, you will be able to outline the importance of classification of mental disorders. And lastly, you will be able to underscore the role of stigma in mental disorders. So let's begin with the first topic. What is the DSM-5? Well, DSM is an abbreviation for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's how you get DSM. So this is a book that is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it is compiled after tedious and meticulous process which involves hundreds of researchers, clinicians and psychiatrists around the world. And the reason it is called DSM-5 is because currently we have the 5th edition, which was published in 2015. So the DSM is a book that evolves. We are in the 5th edition of it right now, but surely I'm sure the work must still be going on about revising concepts within the DSM-5. So this book contains definitions, symptoms, classical features and other information about each and every mental disorder or illness that we know of as of today. So how does the DSM-5 define mental disorders? Well, the entire definition is too long to publish here on this slide, and I encourage you to take a look at it in your own time. It's available on the internet. But what I have done here today is just pass out a couple of key features that I think are of importance as we look at the definition. So the first key feature is that there is a clinically significant disturbance in cognition, emotional regulation or behavior. So what does this mean, clinically significant disturbance? What it states is that the way we think about things that happen around us, so cognitive processes, which can include creative thinking, which can include problem solving, emotional regulation, the way we handle our emotions, or the way we act in our day-to-day lives. In each of these aspects, there is a significant disturbance, a more than normal disturbance, so to speak. So this is the first thing that you have to be aware of, that there is a disturbance in all of these things, but more importantly, it's significant to the point of causing significant distress or disability in various aspects of our lives. So for example, social, occupational and other important activities. So what this essentially means in a nutshell is that because of these disturbances, we are not able to focus to our optimal level of functioning when it comes to activities that we are involved in. And because of this, so that's disability. And because of this disability, we undergo a lot of distress. This distress might be in the form of anxiety, nervousness, and can lead to behavior such as sometimes avoiding the situations altogether. Right? So these are two key features that I have put up here for you all to be aware of. But like I said before, I encourage you to take a look at the definition online and go through it for yourself. So what the DSM does now is tries to classify disorders into various categories. So you have personality disorders, you have mood disorders, you have psychotic disorders and whatnot. There are a lot to list out. But let's just ask ourselves the question, what is the advantages of classifying it? I mean, why classify it in the first place? So first and foremost, classification gives us a nomenclature. It gives a kind of a naming system to the way we address mental disorders. Think of how difficult it would be for one psychiatrist or one psychologist to talk to his or her colleague from across the world without naming the disorder. Imagine a situation where a client has changed the psychiatrist that he visits, and the new psychiatrist is trying to get in touch with the old psychiatrist to discuss the client's history. Imagine the confusion that would arise if there was no nomenclature to discuss the cases. So just by the use of a nomenclature, a lot of time and effort is saved, and the message gets across to the other psychiatrist that this is what the client is taking treatment for. Because of this, we can then study the disorder in detail. Once we name it, we can then differentiate it from other disorders. We can outline the features of the disorders and therefore understand how one disorder or illness is different from the other. And for the community overall, for the psychiatric and the psychological community, the DSM establishes the range of problems that we can address. Now, this is important in the medical profession because when you name any sort of an illness or any sort of a disorder, it also outlines which mental health or which medical community does it come under the purview of. So you can think about it in the context of physical illnesses. So if it's something to do with bones, for example, is the orthopedic department which takes a look at it. If it's something to do with the heart, is the cardiac department. So by naming illnesses in their particular format, we can then place the limits on what disorders we can tackle. So these are broadly the advantages of classifying disorders, and this is one aspect of what the DSM is useful for. However, there are always two sides to any coin. So when it comes to disadvantages of classification, there are some. Simplification of these disorders can lead to a loss of information. Because we tend to name disorders, we often lose out on individual characteristics that a client may display. So this results in the loss of information for a lot of people, because no two people are unique in the way they experience the disorder. It can lead to stereotyping of individuals with mental illnesses. Once you know that particular person is suffering from XYZ disorder, his personality takes a backseat. The disorder becomes more prominent, and we tend to think of that person in the context of that disorder only. And this results in a lot of stigma towards the mentally ill. So let's take a look at mental disorders and stigma, and I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, most of you would know that stigma is a disgrace that is associated with mental illnesses. It's the shame that people experience by virtue of being in proximity to one mental illness or the other. Because of this, it often leads to people hiding the mental disorders. It leads to families not disclosing this to their relatives. It leads to people not seeking quality professional mental help, and therefore going through the trauma of having the mental disorder all by themselves in isolation. On a larger scale, stigma in mental disorders can result in discrimination. People might not be considered for some job positions if their employers know about their past mental health history, and relationships sometimes get broken up when one or the other partner discovers that the other one has had some mental health history. Which is why, for effective well-being and overall well-being, stigma needs to be addressed head-on. So I would encourage you to talk more about mental disorders and illnesses with your friends, peers, relatives, and be open to having conversations about this. That's one of the ways in which you can address stigma on a larger scale. So, in today's video module, we have looked at each of these topics. We have looked at the DSM-5, we have looked at the definition of mental disorders as DSM-5 outlines it. We have looked at classification and the advantages and disadvantages of such a system, and the role that stigma plays in mental health. These are your references. Thank you for listening to me today.